Hello students, the topic we're discussing today is stages of prenatal development. The objectives of this lesson are to understand what happens during the different stages of prenatal development, to describe the developmental course in each stage of prenatal development, to familiarize oneself with the different concepts associated with this developmental phase, to comprehend how environment and heredity work together to determine human characteristics, to be aware of the threats to the fetal environment and what can be done about them, to identify the different characteristic patterns of behavior at each stage of prenatal development. Life begins in the reproductive system of the female set inside her pelvic cavity. Conception usually occurs during a woman's ovulation period or within a few days of it. During this time, the female ovaries release an ovum that, if fertilized by a sperm, will develop into a new human. The term natal in the word prenatal means birth. So prenatal implies before birth, that is, right from the point of fertilization to childbirth. And this period encompasses the 38 weeks or approximately the 9 months of gestation, or what is popularly known as pregnancy. Prenatal development is also referred to as antenatal development. The study of the science of prenatal development is called embryology. During this time of the 38 weeks, the new human organism changes in many ways. The prenatal stage can in fact be divided into 3 phases, and each phase carries its own significance in the development of the human in the womb. And these are the period of the zygote, the period of the embryo, and finally the period of the fetus. We will now examine each of these in detail. We first begin by looking at the period of the zygote, which starts from the point of conception and lasts up to the end of the 2nd week. The egg or the ovum slowly travels through the fallopian tube, and if sperms are present at that location, one of these sperms may unite with the ovum in a process called fertilization. Only one sperm can enter the egg's outer membrane. The moment a sperm penetrates the egg, conception occurs, creating a new and a separate cell called the zygote. If a single zygote divides into 2 to form 2 new embryos, the result is the development of monozygotic or identical twins. If, however, 2 separate ova are released simultaneously by the ovary, and then if they are fertilized by 2 sperms, they form 2 different zygotes which, if implanted on the uterine wall, develop into dizygotic, non-identical or fraternal twins. The fertilized egg, which we call the zygote, is a single cell, but it soon begins to divide. The first division to produce 2 cells takes place within about 24 to 36 hours after fertilization. The cells divide first to form a ball of cells called the morula, which then develops into the blastocyst that involves the formation of a cavity within the morula. The cells, in the course of dividing, travel down the fallopian tube and enter the womb, where the blastocyst implants itself into the wall of the uterus. This happens about 5 to 6 days after fertilization. During the next 5 to 7 days, the blastocyst establishes a primitive placenta and circulation, thus ensuring the supply of nutrients and oxygen essential for its continued development. The possible hazard during this period of the zygote is that due to insufficient glandular hormones or the lack of proper balance between the glands and the ovaries of the mother, the blastocyst may not get implanted and then it dies. During the period of the embryo, which lasts from the 3rd to the 8th week, 3 crucial structures develop from the fertilized egg to protect and sustain the growing life within the mother's uterus, and these are the amniotic sac, the placenta, and the umbilical cord. The amniotic sac contains amniotic fluid, which is a watery liquid in which the developing embryo floats, and thus this serves as a protective buffer. The tendrils that attach the embryo to the uterine wall increase in size and complexity to form a fleshy disc-like structure which is referred to as the placenta. The embryo is joined to the placenta at the abdomen by the umbilical cord, which is a tube that contains blood vessels to carry oxygen and nutrients to the growing baby and remove carbon dioxide and waste products. During the embryonic period, the inner mass of the new organism differentiates into 3 layers. The outermost layer is called the ectoderm, from which develop the skin, hair, nails, and so on. The middle layer, called the mesoderm, is also present, from which muscles, skeleton, and the circulatory as well as the excretory organs develop. And finally, the innermost layer is called the endoderm, from which the gastrointestinal tract, the eustachian tube, lungs, pancreas, salivary glands, and such develop. Many important external and internal features start to grow and function during the embryonic period. The heart, although is only 2-chambered, begins to beat and blood is circulated around the embryo by the end of the 3rd week. This enables the removal of waste and the acquisition of nutrients. As all the body's organs begin to form during this period, the period of the embryo is considered the most critical stage of prenatal development. The potential danger of this stage is that if the embryo does not receive sufficient protection and nourishment, there may be a miscarriage or malformation. The final period of prenatal development is called the period of the fetus, and this starts from the end of 8 weeks and lasts until birth. Both internal and external features continue to grow. The period is marked by the continued development and the differentiation of structures that emerged during the period of the embryo. Basic structures that were laid down in the embryonic period are now refined and they grow into the final form. Very few new structures actually appear during the period of the fetus. It is during this period that the origins of motor, sensory, and learning behavior are to be found. This period is considered safer than the period of the embryo, but it is not completely free from hazards. By the end of the 4th month, mothers feel the fetus movement. At around the 5th month, reflexes such as sucking, swallowing, and hiccuping usually appear. During the 5th month, at 22 weeks, the fetus weighs a little over 1 pound and is about 1 foot in length. The fetus begins to show sensitivity to light and can be stimulated and irritated from this point onward. Although there are a few cases of infants being born and surviving at this time, the chances of survival and the absence of later complications are very slim. Between the 4th and the 6th months, most of the organs that were formed during the first trimester begin to function. If born at this time, the fetus has a chance survival. The point at which it can first survive is referred to as the age of being viable, and this occurs sometime between the 22nd and the 26th weeks. During the 7th month, the fetus is only 3 pounds in weight, and therefore the 7-month-old fetus has a few pounds to gain before reaching the average 7.5 pounds. During this time, the brain continues to develop at an increasingly fast rate. By 7 months, the fetus clearly responds to sounds outside of the womb, and it develops a preference for the tone and the rhythm of the mother's voice. By the 8th month, the fetus has little room for large movements. A layer of fat is added that will assist with temperature regulation. The lungs, however, are still very immature. If born at this time, the infant will likely require some help with breathing. It is not until the 9th month that the lungs are mature enough to regulate breathing on their own without assistance. During the last month of gestation, the baby continues to grow at a rate of about half to 1 pound per week. The lungs are maturing in preparation for that first breath. The baby will also turn around in the womb to a head-down position for birth. The unborn child is not free of threats from different risk factors. Even in the mother's womb, the fetus is unprotected if adequate care is not taken into account. Let us examine some of the risk factors related to prenatal development. The first class of risk factors includes environmental agents that produce abnormalities in the developing fetus, and these are collectively referred to as teratogens. The term teratogen derives from the Greek word teres, meaning marvel or monster. A teratogen exerts its effects largely during critical developmental periods. For instance, between the 20th and the 40th day, the heart of the baby develops, and therefore it's at risk of danger from teratogens. Each teratogen exerts certain specific effects. For instance, rubella, if the mother is suffering from, affects the fetus' heart, eyes and brain, while thalidomide consumption produces malformations of the limb. Either maternal or fetal genotypes may counteract a teratogen's effects, because we know that not all mothers who have rubella produce defective infants. The effects of one teratogen may intensify the effects of another. For instance, nutritional deficiencies may increase the adverse effects of drugs. A particular teratogen may affect the fetus but may not have any discernible effect on the mother. Further, a certain teratogen may produce a variety of deviations, whereas several different teratogens may produce the same kind of deviation. Consider the condition rubella as well as the substances quinine and streptomycin, all of which can individually cause deafness. The longer a fetus is exposed to a particular teratogen and the greater the intensity of the teratogen's effects, the more likely it is that the fetus would be seriously harmed. The first group of teratogens that we're going to look at can be classified as drugs, chemicals and metals. These can cause a wide range of congenital abnormalities, estimated to produce around 10% of birth defects. The severity of the abnormality depends on different factors such as A. The amount of the substance the mother is exposed to, B. The developmental stage of the baby, and C. The period of time over which the mother's exposure to the chemical or the drug or the metal takes place. Let's now examine the list of drugs, chemicals and metals that affect the baby's prenatal development. First up, we have narcotics. Mothers who are addicted to heroin, morphine or methadone, which are narcotic drugs, give birth to addicted babies who show symptoms of withdrawal, and these include tremors, convulsions, difficulty breathing and intestinal disturbances. Such babies may additionally be prone to pneumonia, prematurity and low birth weight. Heroin and morphine can also induce difficulty in conceiving, and in the infant they lead to prematurity, low birth weight, addiction, withdrawal and even death. Smoking and nicotine. These hold dire consequences for the smoker or the nicotine user and can also be hazardous for the child in the womb. Nicotine increases the risk of spontaneous abortions, bleeding during pregnancy, premature rupture of the amniotic sac, and of fetal deaths and the death of newborn. The father's smoking can also be very risky because it can transmit the risk of cancer to the offspring. Mothers who smoke typically give birth to babies who are about 225 grams lighter and smaller in all dimensions, for example, the length and the head circumference, than babies born to non-smokers. Caffeine. This stimulant poses higher risk for miscarriage and low birth weight infants. Alcohol. Abuse of alcohol leads to a fatal condition called fetal alcohol syndrome or FAS, which affects approximately 1 out of every 750 births. FAS leads to a pattern of malformations in which the most serious effect is of mental retardation. Thus, heavy drinkers may place their fetus in grave danger. Further, mothers having 1 or more drinks daily were 3 times more likely to miscarry than mothers who consumed just 1 drink daily. Possible complications include permanent growth retardation, malformations of the face, brain damage, hyperactivity, learning disability, and heart defects. Hence, pregnant women are typically advised to avoid alcohol altogether. Marijuana. This drug also causes difficulty in conceiving, and in the infant it leads to prematurity, low birth weight and high-pitched crying. Next, we have lysergic acid diethylamide or LSD. This psychedelic drug leads to chromosomal breakage. Then we have diethylstilbestrol or DES. This causes prematurity and low birth weight. Female children may develop cancer of the cervix, whereas male children may have reproductive abnormalities and the increased risk of testicular cancer. Thalidomide. This leads to the deformation of the child's face, limbs, fingers and toes. It can also cause malformation of the heart as well as the digestive and the genitourinary tracts. It can also produce malformations or the absence of limbs. Quinine. Traditionally used to treat malaria, quinine has been associated with deafness in the child. Rezapine. This drug can lead to respiratory problems. Tetracycline. The antibiotic is avoided during pregnancy as it can produce defective skeletal growth. Aspirin. This is known to cause blood disorders. Anticonvulsant medications. These drugs, which are used to remedy seizures, can give rise to cleft lip and palate and the failure of blood coagulation. Anesthetics. They cause short-term depression of the infant's responsiveness alongside resulting in impaired attention and motor abilities. Lead. Exposure to this metal can cause miscarriage, anemia and hemorrhage in the mother. And finally, we have methylmercury. This is known to cause cerebral palsy. Having looked at the drugs, now let's look at the second type of teratogen in this lesson, which is radiation. This is an important risk factor since exposure to radiation leads to microcephaly, stunted growth, leukemia, cancer and cataract. We have now looked at the different teratogens. Let's now proceed to look at some of the maternal factors that can have a negative impact on prenatal development. Aspects relating to the mother may also cause dangers to the child in her womb. The mother's knowledge of what is taking place in her body can be very important. Her physical condition, diseases, age, diet, reactions associated with a certain blood component called the Rh factor, and prolonged stress are some of the conditions that affect the prenatal child. First up, we look at physical condition. This can significantly affect the baby's development. Women who weigh less than 45 kilograms in total body weight have risks for pregnancy complications and for delivering underweight infants. Second is the age of the mother. Teenage mothers and those over 35 years of age have a higher risk for miscarriage, premature birth, and some birth defects. Down syndrome is the most common condition in children born to mothers over 40 years of age. Diet. The prenatal development of the baby and further its growth and health after birth are directly related to the mother's diet during pregnancy. Low vitamins and minerals in the maternal diet have an influence on the child, as he or she may suffer from specific weaknesses. Insufficient iron leads to anemia in the infant. Low intake of calcium causes poor bone formation in the child. Inadequate amount of protein also has an effect on the baby because the baby may be smaller than average and may suffer from mental retardation with almost 20% or fewer brain cells. Now we have the Rh factor. This is an inherited genetically dominant trait in the blood that can result in a dangerous situation for the fetus. When blood containing the Rh factor, and we call this the Rh positive blood, is introduced into blood without the Rh factor, which is referred to as the Rh negative blood, antibodies to combat the Rh factor are produced by the Rh negative blood. For instance, consider that there is a mother who is Rh negative while the father is Rh positive. The result could be that the child is Rh positive. Any small rupture in the capillaries of the placenta will release the Rh factor into the mother's bloodstream, causing her body to produce the antibodies needed to fight this Rh factor. The antibodies in the mother's blood will then cross the placenta into the fetal bloodstream and attack its Rh positive red blood cells, thus depriving the fetus of oxygen. The consequence of this may be a miscarriage, possible brain defects, or even the death of the fetus or the newborn child. Now we move on to mother's diseases and disorders. A wide range of maternal diseases and disorders can affect the baby's development. Since the placenta cannot filter out extremely small disease carriers such as viruses, children can be born with malaria, measles, chickenpox, mumps, syphilis, or other venereal diseases that have been transmitted from the mother. Let's look at some of these diseases. First, we have rubella. If the mother contracts rubella during the first 3 months of pregnancy, she is likely to give birth to a child with a congenital abnormality such as heart disease, cataract, deafness, or even mental retardation. HIV/AIDS. The vast majority of children with HIV/AIDS had contracted the disease sometime between early pregnancy and birth. Toxemia. This is a frightening condition involving high blood pressure and protein in the urine that are potentially fatal for the mother as well as for the fetus. Mothers with toxemia frequently give birth to premature babies. Anoxia. This is a condition in which the brain of the baby does not receive sufficient oxygen to allow it to develop properly. Anoxia can cause certain forms of epilepsy, mental deficiency, cerebral palsy, and even behavior disorders. Mumps. This is characterized by swelling and pain around the neck and is accompanied by fever and headache. This leads to the malformation of some kind in the baby. Hypertension. High blood pressure gives rise to fatal abnormalities, miscarriage, and death. Diabetes. Blood sugar abnormalities lead to preeclampsia, which is high blood pressure during pregnancy, or eclampsia, which refers to a severe progression of preeclampsia that is accompanied by seizures in the mother. Diabetes is also associated with hypertension, stillbirth, or the death of the newborn. Syphilis. This is a sexually transmitted bacterial infection that results in miscarriage. The child may even be born blind or could be mentally retarded. Now let's look at the mother's emotional states. The mother's emotions influence the fetus through glandular changes, and these could result in troubled pregnancies, miscarriages, long labor, and even delivery complications. Infants of mothers who have experienced a lot of negative emotions may be hyperactive, irritable, and may have feeding and sleep problems. Pregnant women must thus avoid stress and negative emotional experiences. Birth hazards. Certain factors at the time of birth also cause damage to the child, and these include hemorrhaging and the failure to breathe early. Injury to the head during delivery destroys brain vessels. The brain cells die due to a lack of oxygen. The child may also die or experience mental retardation and could have difficulty to speak. Due to damage to the cells of the brain stem, motor defects are also likely to occur. Hence, the baby during prenatal development in the womb is prone to a number of hazards which nonetheless are avoidable if proper care is exercised. Prenatal development is typically divided into 3 distinct periods, and these are the period of the zygote, the period of the embryo, and finally the period of the fetus. These phases represent continuous stages of development during which The organism is protected and sustained by the amniotic sac, the placenta, and the umbilical cord. The period of the zygote ranges from the point of conception and lasts up to the end of the second week. The period of the embryo occurs between the end of the second week and goes on up to 8 weeks or 2 lunar months. The final stage of prenatal development, that is the period of the fetus, starts from the end of 8 weeks and goes on until birth. Internal and external features continue to grow during this period. Throughout prenatal development, teratogens, which are agents that produce developmental abnormalities, may affect the growing organism, resulting in physical and mental deviations. Consumption of or exposure to drugs, chemicals, metals, and radiation have deleterious effects within the womb and after the child is born. Further, maternal factors such as her age at pregnancy, body weight, diet, Rh factor, diseases, and emotional states substantially affect the child's well-being. Finally, hazards during birth can also cause complications for the child. It is not without reason then that pregnancy is considered an extremely critical period for the well-being of both the child in the womb as well as for the mother. Awareness of these issues and the practice of care are vital for healthy prenatal development.